Hi, my name's Rachel Evans. Thank you for joining me today. I would like to talk to you a little bit about the PMO, or the Project Management Office. In particular, what a PMO is, why organisations should consider having one, how you might go about setting one up, and how, if you've already got one, if it's not performing as you need to, what you might want to do to try and improve the situation. The process is actually surprisingly similar. It's something that, from a professional point of view, I've set up PMOs around the world for some great organisations. Apologies, I don't want to drop any names. Just suffice to say that what I have learned is that there's some fairly consistent processes that enable us to understand what we've got, what we're trying to do, and how we might go about improving it. So why might we want a PMO in the first place? Well, really, a PMO is there for a number of reasons, but primarily it's there as a control function, if you will. It's about bringing together existing activities and trying to create a greater degree of visibility, of consistency, repeatability, insight. It's about collating information and presenting it in a way that adds value to other stakeholders. And really, it's also about supporting our people. So if we're going to capture and report data, we want it to be consistent. So we want to work with the people that we ask to deliver the projects for us. We want to make sure they've got the right training, that they're aware of what we mean when we say a project is red, amber, green. And really just try and help them to help us to try and understand from an organisational point of view. We want to make sure that the projects that are in flight still add value. So quite often when we start a project, something changes about the operating environment. It may be market conditions, it may be a whole host of things really. But what we want to do is we want to step back, and occasionally we want to say, okay, does this project still make sense? Where changes occur, it may be to budget, it may be to scope, it may be around the overall objective of the project. So it's making sure that the project is still on track to deliver what we want as an organisation, and indeed, if necessary, to stop a project if the outcome is no longer going to meet the needs of the organisation. So it's very much about aligning the strategic objectives of an organisation to the tactical process of delivering a project through the consistency of process, the predictability and the repeatability and the reliability of that data. So I guess the first thing we want to have a look at is what's really the first step in establishing our PMO, or, as I said in the very brief introduction, if you've already got a PMO and you don't feel that it's delivering value, why not? What is it that we need to change about our existing PMO? So let's take a look at that now. Now, before we dive too deep, it's important that we start off with the right set of expectations. Quite often, in fact, something I see repeatedly is around stakeholder expectations. There's this assumption that we're going to invest and we're going to set up a PMO and we're going to start seeing the results from day one. And that's really not the case, unfortunately. Establishing and refining a PMO, because it is a process of continual improvement. It's about feedback from stakeholders and all the participants in the projects. It typically takes around 12 to 18 months. As I've already touched upon, it's an iterative process. It's about refinement. It's about collating feedback. It's about making adjustments as we go along. Indeed, any good PMO that's been around for any period of time and is still adding huge value to an organisation, you'll find when you look behind the scenes that there is a very clear and very strong feedback mechanism, and there is a whole host of processes behind it that make sure that what the PMO is doing is both relevant today, but is also continuing to stay relevant for tomorrow. So before we dive any deeper, just bear that in mind, that a PMO is an iterative process and it's a process that takes 12 to 18 months. And that's regardless of whether or not you're setting up a new PMO or you're actually going to try and remediate an existing one. So the first thing we want to look at and we want to try and understand is, what is our current capability? So what are our projects like today? And what do I mean by that? So when we're delivering projects, are we delivering them in a consistent manner? Is it that all the project managers are following the same process? Some projects, especially in the tech world, might be waterfall in nature. Some of them might be following an agile methodology. They're both potentially right. It depends upon the project itself, but really that whatever methodology we're following, it's fairly consistent. That when we talk about a project being red, amber or green, we're consistent in terms of that definition. So we know that we can go from project to project, and when we're talking about the budgeting process, the planning, the scheduling, the status reporting, etc., that all projects will perform in a consistent method? Or is it a case that we've got some great people delivering projects today, but it's really being done in a fairly inconsistent manner? There's nothing specifically wrong with that on the surface, but in order to collate data and make it more consistent, we need to look at the consistency of the process, the methods, the data that we're capturing, and so forth. So understanding our current capability is really the first step. Where is it we are today? So that when we start to plan our roadmap in the next step, we can start to think of this as a journey. So we are here today and we want to go here. We can't plan any journey without knowing where we want to start from. And from a PMO perspective, understanding our current capability is that first step. So please don't rush into anything. Make sure you do a good assessment first of your capability. So once you understand the capability of your project management team, you want to think about, okay, what's good, what needs improvement, and really where you're trying to go with the PMO. It's very important that we start to think about the organization and its strategic goals. So we've established a PMO to help oversee some projects. Those projects should be there to deliver to the organizational strategy. Well, is that organizational strategy clear? Do the current projects align to that strategy? And are we continuing to monitor them in such a way that that strategy remains true? We don't continue a project that no longer meets our needs. We want to start thinking about budget management. We want to start thinking about the communications, the training, maybe how the what's, when, what and whys about what we're doing. And really the next step is to say, okay, so when we establish a PMO, why? What do we want from it? What are its goals? What are its goals going to be in the short term, the medium term, and ultimately the long term? Because this is something that we want to establish as a long-term goal. So by now we've thought about, okay, what our problem is, or our current capability, if we think of it that way. We're thinking about where we're trying to go as an organization. And now we're trying to say, okay, well, what do we want from our PMO? How are we going to deliver it? Who's going to deliver it? What are our expectations? Remember, it's typically a 12 to 18 month life cycle to really get things up and running efficiently. So who's going to be doing what, when and why? Who's going to be involved within an organization? What are those routines going to look like? So what are we going to be saying? Who are we going to be saying it to? And when are we going to be saying it to them? So a great example of that is a project status report. So if we're going to produce a project status report of all of the projects, if you think of it as a PMO summary, we want to be saying the same thing to a group of stakeholders on the same day of the week, or every other week, or every other month, depending on what the organizational appetite is. The reason why we want to start off very early on and start thinking about our deliverables and our cycles of delivery is really we're trying to establish a heartbeat, if you think of that, a rhythm. So when people get used to a rhythm, it becomes natural. So starting off thinking about routines, deliverables, communications, those outputs, and to whom, the sooner you start to establish that rhythm, the sooner you start to make it a repeatable and accepted process. Now, if you've already got a PMO in place, this is a great time to say, okay, is this something that you do? Is it something that you intend maybe to get a consolidated report out every Friday? But in reality, it might be Monday, it might be Tuesday, or every now and again, well, we might wait until the end of the next week for various reasons. Well, the minute we start to do that, we start to develop an irregular heartbeat, if you think of it that way, and that's not very healthy. So thinking about our PMO, its objectives, its outputs, our routines, the heartbeat that underlines a PMO, these are really, really important. So that really is your next step. What is it we want from the PMO, when, where, how, and so forth. Now, you've probably gathered that I've already spoken a lot about routines, communications, etc. Well, underlying that from a PMO perspective is this idea of data. A PMO is there to try and consolidate the picture of all of these different projects that are going on and report it in that consistent, repeatable manner to the various stakeholders. So collecting data is really important. Now, probably the biggest challenge I come across when I look at a PMO that's already in flight or in the early stages of planning is that they're looking at data from a process point of view only. So are people submitting status reports? Are people doing it on a Thursday or a Friday, for example? Is everybody doing something? Is there data that we can capture? Well, that on the surface sounds like the right thing to do, but it's actually the wrong thing. And that's because of this concept of GIGO, or garbage in, garbage out. As we collect data, the data integrity, the value of the data that we're capturing is really more important than the process itself. So what is it that we're capturing? Is it predictable? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? Or is it that the process around the data collation means that the project manager is just submitting a status report on a Friday because he knows that he has to do it, and it's a case of getting it over the line? And this is really one of those big drivers for failure, in that you're going to start taking that data, and not only is it being presented in a reluctant way, but what you then do with that data is going to be of limited value. The minute people start to mistrust data, the minute they start to ignore it. So looking at data quality around your data capture is really the most important part around your data itself. It's also important to make sure that if you're collating that data and you're bringing it in from the projects and those people engaged in it, you actually do something with it. You show it to the other stakeholders. You make it relevant to them. You show it in a manner that they want to consume it. It may be that you have a data set and you have to slice and dice it in a number of ways so that it's meaningful for the particular audience. You may want to start off with something simple like an Excel worksheet, for example, where you can add, or rather show or hide columns depending on who the recipients are. So make sure that the data collation is not the point of the process. Because it's like a database. We don't collect data and populate the database without having a use for it. It's not a one-way database, as they say. So when we go out and we collect our data, let's make sure that it's consistent, it's reliable, it's quality data. And when we've got that data, that we are doing something meaningful with it. We're taking it and we're presenting it to our stakeholders in a way that they want to read it, in a way that ultimately adds value to them. Now, a crucial part of any PMO is this idea that we capture and we manage risks and issues to our projects, to our overall portfolio or programs, really to the very meaning of the PMO itself. And that often starts with the basics, and that is, you'd be surprised at how often project managers and stakeholders in the projects don't know the difference between a risk and an issue. Well, I guess in a nutshell, the easiest way to think of it is a risk is something that hasn't yet happened. It might happen. The chances of it happening are its probability. Let's say it's low, medium or high. And then we want to understand that if this risk actually happened, if that risk was realized, as we call it, well, what's the impact? Is it, again, let's keep it simple, low, medium or high? So we obviously want to pay more attention to the high probability of happening risks or those that have a high impact should they be realized. Now, like I said, a risk is something that may happen. And what we typically try and do is we try and mitigate those risks. So when we're working with risks within the PMO, we want to make sure there's mitigation activity. Now, that mitigation activity really has two flavors. First of all, that's how do we try and stop the risks from being realized itself? But also, what are we going to do? Because we've now identified that this is a particular risk. How do we try and minimize either the probability, the likelihood of it happening, or indeed the impact should it happen? So really, if a risk is realized, we know what to do about it and we can get about fixing it as quickly as possible. And that really now makes us think about the other item I mentioned, and that is issues. So if a risk is something that might happen, an issue is something that actually has. Now, a risk that has been realized, it's something we've been tracking and managing. If it comes to fruition, it is now an issue. Now, an issue has an impact. That's why we've been tracking it, or not, and I'll explain in a minute. But an issue is something that has happened that has a negative impact upon a project. And we need to plan and manage that occasion accordingly. So what we would typically do is say, okay, we now have an impact behind this issue. Again, let's keep it simple, low, medium or high. And we now need to start talking about the remediation of this. So what is it we're trying to do to fix this? Who's going to fix it? When are they going to fix it by? In itself, an issue remediation becomes part of the project plan now. Now, I did touch and I hinted at different variations there. So first of all, a realized risk becomes an issue. But in reality, not all issues were once risks. And what do I mean by that? So we try and track and manage what we think is appropriate, the things that are often inside our sphere of influence. Now, occasionally things are going to happen to us that we couldn't forecast. And we find ourselves having to react there and then. So it's fair to say that a realized risk is an issue, but not all issues were once risks. And the other thing I hinted at is that let's not assume that all issues are always negative, because it may be that something happens that enables us to deliver earlier. It may be that a supplier suddenly offers us a massive discount in their pricing, for example, and that frees up finances either to spend on other functionality or maybe to try and bring the dates forward. So an issue we tend to think of as negative, but it can actually be positive as well. Now, what we try and do within the PMO is we try and capture and prioritize our risks and issues accordingly so that we present them to our shareholders, our stakeholders, in a way that matters to them. We're not going to talk too much about those risks that have a low probability of happening and have a low impact upon us. We're going to talk more about the high probability, high impacts, or those issues that we now need their help with. They've got a high impact and changes have happened and they are significant. So we're going to think about within the PMO how we communicate this to the relevant stakeholders, and we do that through risk and issue prioritization and likelihood of it happening, impact are really two of the first great criteria that you can have a look at when it comes to risk and issue management. Now, setting up a PMO is not just about data, it's not just about processes, it's not just about reporting. Underlying all of this is this idea of project culture, and this is something that most organizations miss. I would say probably 8 out of 10 PMOs that I initially look at from a remediation point of view, what I tend to see is that the process, the PMO, the data capture cycles and so on and so forth are almost used as a battering ram to police, to control, to manage the people that are delivering the projects for us, when the reality is the PMOs are actually there to support, to facilitate, to make sure that where we've got a high impact issue, for example, that we get the project managers the right focus, the right attention at the right point in time. If there are dependencies, that the PMO is trying to support them. But it's identifying trends as well. It's saying to project managers, okay, I noticed that as a team, we quite often, we're fairly inconsistent in our status reporting. So when we talk about a project being red, amber or green, let's have a look at that and let's try and be consistent. So part of what a PMO is trying to do is that support and the facilitation. It's also about training, it's about awareness, it's about communications, and it's about enablement. It's not just about beating people up. And the reason why I say it's not just about is obviously you will always find your passive resistors. The larger the organization is, the more likely this is to happen. So it is about making sure that people are sticking to and following the routines. And if not, trying to work with them to make sure that we can get things within routine. But culturally, one of the things the worst offender I typically see is this idea of status reporting, red, amber or green. The number one issue from a cultural point of view is this idea that a project manager is afraid to say that their project is anything other than green. That if they fear that if they say their project is red, for example, that's a negative, that somehow they're not managing their project. Well, the reality is a great project manager understands that saying a project is red is very much about saying, hey, stakeholders, I have an issue with my project. I'm managing multiple components. Something's not working here and I want you to help me. And by saying that it's red, what the project manager is doing is giving the organization the opportunity to step in and help fix things. But as I've already alluded, a lot of PMOs really go for this idea that red is bad. And we reward the project managers that deliver us a green project. And what we need to be doing is we actually need to be doing both. We need to be recognizing those that say a project is red just as much as those that we know that a project is green. Because what we don't want is we don't want an environment where people are afraid to tell the truth about their projects. Because ultimately what they're doing through the PMO is removing the organization the opportunity to help. So culture is really important, and it's the PMO that's at the heart of this. So let's make sure that when we look at our PMO, we start off and we're thinking, let's get the culture right. Now, in setting up the PMOs, that I typically find that people do an awful lot of research, and they often get directed, dazzled, if you will, by various tools that are out there on the market today. The latest project management framework, the latest data capture tool, the latest reporting tool. Really, people are all trying to sell silver bullets. And what I'm going to say, especially during the early days, is we try and avoid this. We want to avoid this because, as I alluded at the start, a good PMO is iterative in nature. And what's going to happen is that when the requirements you have in your early days, the processes, the data, the outputs, etc., behind your PMO, they are going to evolve and they're going to change. Now, in this industry, there's some great salespeople who will try and convince you that you can achieve nirvana by buying their tool, by investing in their consultants, in their processes, etc. And what I'm actually going to urge is to do the opposite, to start light, to start by thinking, okay, let's treat this as an iterative process, that yes, we may want these tools and processes in the future, but really we don't want them today. But really, let's just keep an eye on it for the future. Remember, a lot of people are going to try and tell you that this is best in class. Well, guess what? Everybody's trying to earn the distinction of doing the best in class. And so what happens is the best in class just becomes average. That's not something you want to do. But also what you don't want is you don't want to structure your PMO, your outputs, your processes, etc. around the tool. You want to wait until you have a fairly consistent method so that when you do select your tools, your frameworks, etc., they actually match the needs of the organization. It's not about adapting the organization to the tool, but the tool must fit the needs of the organization. And early adoption of that can really hamper the effective adoption of the right tools and processes. So please don't rush into it. You're going to see lots of information out there on the internet, lots of people talking about the latest PPM tools, but really in the early days, you don't need these. Start off and think of it as an iterative process, and there will be a natural point in either in the development or the improvement of your PMO where it now makes sense. It's not something that you need at day one, no matter what people are going to try and tell you. So I guess in conclusion, setting up a PMO at the outset, and again when you're trying to remediate an existing PMO that is seen to be underperforming, it can seem like a daunting task, but it's actually not. It's a case of saying, okay, what's our current capability? What is it the organization needs? How are we going to take the two together and bring it together? And then how are we going to work in an iterative process of continual improvement to the point where we start to establish the heartbeat that I spoke about earlier? How are we going to develop a culture that encourages accuracy, honesty, clarity? Because ultimately what you want is you want good, reliable data from your PMO that actually enables an organization to make the right decisions at the right point in time in a way that adds the most value to an organization, so that we are collaboratively maximizing the return, not just on the projects, its design, its process, but also that we're taking the organization and its people on a journey so that we're all striving to hit the same goals. It's not an overnight process. There's no point trying to pretend that it is. There is no silver bullet. Every organization is different, and depending on where it's starting from, its current capability will go a long way to deciding what the early steps are, and really how long it's going to be before we get that heartbeat, we get the consistency. So go slowly, have fun while you're doing this. Make sure you take the people along for the journey, develop the right culture, keep focused on the goals, make sure that it is all about integrity, honesty, clarity, repeatability, and all those other good words. And if you follow these simple guidelines, you will find that it's actually not too difficult with time to get the great result that you deserve. So I guess thank you for watching. If you've got any questions at all, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, good luck. Enjoy the journey. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.